If we have a look at Nikon and Sony's wide-angle prime lens lineup, I think you're going to find some significant holes. And to start with, looking at Nikon, they've got a 20mm f1.8 lens, but they don't have anything wider than that. And looking at Sony, they have a 20mm f1.8 lens, which is one of my personal favorite lenses. But beyond that, you go all the way down to 14mm, and they've got a 14mm lens. It's an f1.8 and it's about $1,500 or something like that. So this has left a huge hole in these lens lineups, which seems a bit crazy to me because ultra-wide lenses have become so popular now. I mean, you can use them for night sky photography, landscape, vlogging, real estate, interiors, travel. They are so extremely useful. And in all these situations, if you want the highest quality, sharpest image, generally you should be shooting with a prime lens, not a zoom lens. And if you want to shoot in low light conditions, you're pretty much limited to a prime lens, something that opens to f1.8, doesn't start at f2.8. And because of that, I think this is really a super important lens, and it's also incredibly affordable. And everybody that I've seen talk about it has just said, wow, it's kind of a no-brainer if you're shooting full frame on Nikon or Sony. All right, what is this lens? This is the Viltrox 16mm f1.8. And this lens was sent out to me at no cost to myself. This isn't a paid or sponsored video, and Viltrox had no say in the making of the video. I'll put those links in the description down below to where you can find the lens, including a discount code that I've got from Viltrox, which will get you a little bit better deal on the 16mm. The first thing that I see this lens absolutely excellent for is travel. And I know we often find ourselves in environments, it might be the bottom of a canyon or in a historic building or a beautiful church. Any situation where we've got this wraparound environment and we're just looking and we're like, wow, this is just so incredible. This just being here, the feeling of it. And then we take a photo and we look at it and we're like, nah, that just doesn't do it. I find often that is because we're not using a wide enough angle lens. And that's because our eyes have this huge wide field of view that really is only recreated with a super wide lens that allows the viewer to feel like they are part of the environment. They are inserted into the scene. And you'll often hear people say that a 50mm focal length is the equivalent to what the human eye sees. And if you actually think about what you are seeing right now in the room or staring at your iPad or TV or whatever it is, how much of the scene you can see, this is not at all a 50mm field of view. This is an ultra wide field of view because you can see all the way over here and you can see all the way over here. And because of that, I think when you're trying to capture an environment and make someone feel that same feeling that you feel in that environment, an ultra wide angle lens is the way to go. And the other thing that ultra wide angle lenses have become very popular for is vlogging. And that's because you can just hold that camera and that lens at an arm's length. You can get your face and probably mid-torso in the scene, but you also get this wraparound environment where it sets the scene where you are, and it is much more interesting for the viewer to see the person, but also the environment that they're in, because that's kind of what vlogging is all about. The other thing about an ultra-wide angle lens like this is the fact that the movement of your hand creates less movement in the scene. So a wide angle lens like this is going to be much more stable when you're walking and moving about. It also will work particularly well if you've got a camera that has digital image stabilization that does need to crop in a little bit. Even if you crop in when you've got this ultra wide angle lens, you've got a little bit more real estate to work with, which is going to allow you to use that digital crop and still get a reasonably wide image. The other thing this lens is going to be great for is real estate in architecture. Once again, because it gets you that wraparound image, it's going to give you that real estate look where the room or whatever you're photographing is a little bit bigger in the image or looks bigger in the image than what it really is. And it's also going to give you that wraparound environment for architecture where you're going to see all the details, and it's really going to put the person in that building or in that environment. The other thing this lens is going to be great for is landscape photography, and I do have to put a little caveat on that because with a lens this wide, you really have to have a certain level of skill to master it in landscape photography. And that's because with a wide lens like this, you are going to get a strong emphasis on your foreground. So when thinking about composing an image, you're going to have a foreground, midground, and background in mind. Now, since I was out, I really didn't have an opportunity to go to any beautiful locations, but I've shot just a couple of sample images and you can kind of see how the things in the foreground are emphasized. Another great use is going to be night sky photography. Now, I haven't used this lens for night sky photography yet, but I did see a really good video that someone did. Just was incredible with this building and the stars in the background. And actually, I'll link that video in the description down below, because if you're interested in night sky photography, he was saying that this is one of his #1 recommended options. There are some caveats to that as well, because it does have a fair bit of vignette, so you have to play with it a little bit in editing. But if you look at the images that he got, they're absolutely incredible. So I think if you're looking at doing some night sky photography, once again, I think it's going to be really a no-brainer for that as well. And it also could be used for some environmental portrait. Now, you have to be careful, and you probably need that person more towards the middle of the image, unless you're trying to create some crazy distorted look, which is a thing that you do see environmental portrait. So I've got a few sample images. I didn't have anybody with me that I could really set up for environmental portrait, but I think it does represent an interesting prospect for environmental portrait, getting that super wraparound image and just setting that person in the scene. And even though this is a budget lens for a 16mm f1.8 lens, it is incredibly well built. And I think the only criticism that I have seen about this lens is that some people are saying it is a little bit on the big side. But honestly, when you're looking at going to f1.8 and you're at 16mm and full frame, the lens is going to be reasonably big, and there's really no getting around that. The other thing that's nice about this lens is it is weather sealed. It does have a weather sealing gasket. It's an all metal lens based on a metal lens mount. It has a USB-C port for updating the firmware in the lens. It also has 2 programmable buttons, which you can use as a focus hold. It has a click and declick aperture ring option, as well as an aperture ring on the lens. And uniquely, it also has an LCD display, which shows you the focus distance, how far you are currently focusing on the lens, and the aperture. So it really has an incredibly rich feature set for a lens of this price point. The distortion performance with the lens is good without being perfect. You have somewhat of a wavy pattern rather than an easier to correct linear pattern. There is a profile in Lightroom for the correction, but just be aware of that. There are a limited number of situations where you will notice, if you've got straight lines, that they are somewhat wavy, but not something you notice in most situations. Now, if I were to pick the biggest optical flaw of this lens, it is vignette, and it does have some very dark corners if they are uncorrected. And when I brought it into Lightroom, even with the correction profile on, I had to sort of crank that up to 200 to try to get those corners bright enough that they thought they were okay. I think in the corners, it's down by about 3 stops of light. So just something to be aware of. Super heavy vignette, and you're really going to want to correct that. The lens exhibits near perfect chromatic aberration performance with no purple fringing on in-focus areas and no color cast in the bokeh or background blur before and after the plane of focus. This is something I was really surprised by, because it is a pretty optically sophisticated lens, but no worry as far as chromatic aberration goes. And the flare performance on the lens was excellent, which is often super hard for ultra wide angle lenses because they look and see so wide. There's so much opportunity for light to come in and diffract and bounce around in the lens. But I found the flare performance near on perfect. And even when I had light just directly streaming in situations where much more expensive lenses did not fare pretty well, this thing really had little to no flare. The lens doesn't focus very close or have a very big maximum magnification, but when you are at the minimum focus distance, the image quality is excellent. It's super sharp. It's just as good as it is at infinity. And the fact that it is an ultra wide angle lens does give you that kind of surreal look where you've got that thing in the frame and then the background is pushed away and you get this kind of crazy wraparound image with this prominent object in the middle of frame. So it is still a reasonably good close-up lens, even though it doesn't focus quite as close as I might like. And probably the strongest optical trait of this lens is sharpness. It is like razor sharp in the middle at f1.8. At f1.8 in the corners, it's not quite as sharp as it is in the middle, but it's still surprisingly sharp. Stop it down to f2.8 and it's nearly perfect across the entire frame. And in situations where you're going to be shooting landscape, probably at f8 or f11, it is absolutely razor sharp from the center of the frame to the very extreme corners. So anytime that you're shooting this lens stop down, you are going to get a super sharp, optically near perfect performance that you're not really going to get out of most zoom lenses, even if they're stopped down to f8 or f11. And looking at the bokeh and background blur, you don't get a lot of it unless you get really close to something. But when you do get it, it is acceptable. I wouldn't say it is my favorite bokeh or background blur that I've seen, but it is reasonably good and I think fine. And for the way that this lens is used, I think the performance of the background blur is okay. This is a reasonably large, ultra-wide, full-frame lens, but on the complete other end of the spectrum is a 250mm full-frame lens that will fit in your pocket. And I've just shown that video on screen now. This is probably one of the most interesting and fun lenses that I've used this year.